Welcome to everybody. Our first, the two speakers, Heather and Sarah. Heather is an assistant professor of curriculum theory at Queen's University in Ontario. I first met her when she was completing her doctorate at the University of British Columbia, and have followed her closely ever since on topics such as historical thinking, Indigenous perspectives on the past, and now the Anthropocene. She grew up in Nunavut in the Eastern Arctic, and Inuit youth and Inuit education have been very important in her career. She is one of the founders of Shean, Social Studies History Education in the Anthropocene Network, SSHEAN. And if you which is has a broader goal of reimagining education for history education for the facing the Anthropocene. And if you haven't seen their quite impressive website, I certainly encourage you to do that. It's full of, I think, worthwhile resources and research. And our second presenter is Sarah Karn, who teaches environmental education also at Queen's. She is a founding member of Shean, like Heather, and is its program coordinator. She's a PhD candidate at Queen's, looking at studying the historical empathy in Canadian history education, and is especially interested in exploring how the affective elements of learning history can play a role in dealing with the challenges, the emotional aspects of facing the climate crisis. So the presentation is based on recent research that they've done with Indigenous educators and their allies in Ontario. And it's timely, clearly relevant to teaching climate history, and I'm very pleased to welcome them. So I turn it over to you, Heather and Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. What a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much for the invitation to be here and to share our work. I have a little cold, so pardon me as I struggle through with my voice today. So I won't repeat anything that Tom just said. Thanks so much for that introduction. But I do want to take a moment to mention that two other members of our team are here today. So Leif Kretz and Micah Flavin are members of our research team, and thanks, yeah, and very, very valuable, have made very valuable contributions, and we're really pleased to have them here. And also Dr. Jackson Pind, who's located at Trent University, doesn't look like he's here, but is a really important member of our team. All right, Sarah, if you want to.
Yeah, I'll just get the slides up here. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
Yeah, it looks good. So thanks, we can go to that. Perfect. So I identify as a white settler scholar, and I'm located here on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, which is represented by the sort of color clouds there on the map in red and purple respectively. And I've been thinking about Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships for a long time, because I grew up in the Arctic, which is sort of the background picture on Zoom. And so this is a lifelong commitment for me, is thinking about how my work can be better informed by Indigenous knowledges and contribute to decolonizing. And now I do that work in what is also referred to as Kingston, Kingston, Ontario, on the edge of Lake Ontario, just south of the start of the Canadian Shield region, at the confluence of the Cataraqui and St. Lawrence rivers, close to the US border. So it's a really interesting geographic spot. And I'm just really excruciatingly aware, to be honest, that I've come to this territory specifically to work for a settler colonial institution, a university that sits on land that was supposedly purchased from the nations whose relationships to this place were preeminent. But that purchase by the crown in 1783 was not well documented. It surely involved coercion, was based on significant ambiguity around the terms of the territory in question, and was followed by forcible displacement and exclusion of Indigenous peoples from these lands. And because I've inherited intergenerational wealth and social capital and white privilege from my families, I can afford to own property in Kingston on land that those whose ancestors are buried here cannot access. And that's something that I think about. It's about every day, and work to consider my responsibilities flowing from that situation. I also want to give a quick nod to our more than human neighbors here on the land and mention that if you come to visit in May or June, which I do recommend, please come in and drive up with me into our lake country. You might be so lucky as to have to stop on the road for a turtle crossing. And this is a very, very old snapping turtle that this turtle on the road this past spring when we were on our way to a research retreat. So gratitude for our neighbors here. All right, Sarah, I'll invite you to introduce yourself.
So we'll keep it on. Oops. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Karn, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University. My doctoral research explores historical empathy within history education in Canada, and I've taught in both elementary and secondary schools within Ontario, as well as environmental education courses for teacher candidates. I am currently situated on neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, or what is also referred to as Guelph, Ontario, which is about 350 kilometers southwest of where Heather is located. As a white settler educator, I am committed to learning about and from Indigenous knowledges and ways of being, and considering how we might improve relations with other people as well as more than human beings. And I feel very fortunate to be part of Heather's project, and I'm happy to be here today to share about our research with this group. So in our presentation today, we will give some more context for the network we are creating. We will provide an overview of one component of our current research portfolio, which is a set of interviews that we conducted with experts in Indigenous studies and the intersection of that field with education for climate change. And we'll share our findings from those interviews, which we organized into the 3 categories of barriers, strengths, and suggestions for the future. And then we'll conclude with a few sort of next steps. We are the Social Studies and History Education in the Anthropocene Network, which we affectionately refer to by the acronym SHEEN. SHEEN's goal is to reimagine social studies and history education as a place that centers and takes seriously the learning and change that's necessary to respond to the climate crisis. We would like to see teachers acting as if that wicked problem and its intersecting crises were a priority for what youth learn in school. Our work to date has been largely focused on the context in which we work, which is Ontario and certainly within Canada. However, our first publication actually was with a UK-based journal called Rethinking History, and here's the citation for that piece, in which we began to ask questions and suggest some directions for a new orientation in our subject area. We argue that the task is much bigger than adding climate to our curriculum content. It calls on us to consider some more radical changes. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into great detail about all the directions that our research is taking us. We've conducted some curriculum analysis, more extended theoretical analysis, and pedagogical suggestions based on the literature and history and many other disciplines, as well as interviews with experts, which is the subject of our presentation for today. And we've also engaged in resource development on our website, which you can find the link to here on this slide. And I also typed it into the chat earlier. So on this website, you can find teaching materials, including classroom-ready lessons, a primer on preparing for eco-anxiety in a history classroom, and an assignment suggestion. And it's important to note that we're taking a holistic approach to imagining the future of history education. This is not just about teaching the history of the climate, although that in and of itself is a huge challenge. It's also about teaching in ways and about things that will help youth live well in relation to climate crisis. That might be learning about how to affect policy change over time, or what species protection measures really work based off of past examples, or how Indigenous cosmology center the more than human differently from Western worldviews, or how to manage your emotions when you feel threatened.
All right, so this year I conducted 13 interviews with experts in our field and relevant adjacent fields. The interview participants were teacher educators or researchers, or both, located in universities in Ontario, or whose research is focused specifically on the Ontario context. The logic behind inviting these individuals into the interviews was doing our own homework, so to speak, to understand what's already happening in our field of history and social studies, if anything, to attend to the environment and what we can build on, and also to sort of find out what's happening in proximate fields, adjacent fields, such as environmental history, where we have in Canada a huge, very active area of scholarship, but not a lot of that scholarship in environmental history makes it into our K-12 classrooms. So we see that as kind of, so far, it's been a bit of a missed opportunity. I identified individuals for these interviews through my own networks, including folks who actively expressed interest in collaborating with me, or folks who've come to my presentations and so on. So although the recruitment of participants wasn't intended to be representative, really in any particular way, we are really pleased that we were able to access a range of perspectives and locations. So within the 13 interviews, there are 8 different universities represented from 9 different geographic locations around Ontario. So to represent the range of expertise we accessed through this set of interviews, we commissioned Sheen member Micah Flavin, who's here today, to help us with this little animation. So if you indulge in imagining the chanterelle mushroom at the top as being the fruits of our research labor, you will want to know that we're drawing on experts who come from the roots, or the primary roots, of 4 different fields. So Indigenous studies, environmental education, environmental history, and social studies and history education. And from those 4 green-colored prominent roots, you can see other offshoots that represent the subfields and related areas that our participants identify with or participate in. So I won't read them all at the moment, but you can see things, for example, like curriculum studies, land-based learning, outdoor ed, climate justice ed, energy history, historical consciousness, and geography. So again, we're really trying to tap into a lot of different areas of teaching and scholarship to draw strength. So thanks again, Micah, for that visual representation. In the presentation today, I'll be sharing our findings specifically from 4 of the interviews. So only 4 of the 13, 2 with Indigenous scholars who work in Indigenous education, and 2 with non-Indigenous scholars who also very intentionally and predominantly work in Indigenous studies in teacher education, or their educational research is focused on Indigenous content, Indigenous studies. They all work in relation to different Indigenous nations, so we'll be careful about making broad generalizations, but we're trying to draw from the nations that we're connected to, so Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. And then they also are located at 4 different universities. What we've selected from our findings today, specifically for this audience in mind, so thinking about things that you as an international audience may be interested in, we've really narrowed into things related to history as a subject area and K-12 teaching. We have some broader ideas that are sort of more relevant to broader context, but we'll try to stay focused today. So the first thing we want to start by saying is that we feel like all of our work needs to be understood in the context of the affordances and limitations imposed by working in schools and universities that are settler colonial institutions. So we're calling that kind of the backdrop or the background. We recognize that we participate in perpetuating settler colonialism in the places and relationships through which our work is flowing. There's really, in our view, no way to avoid the likelihood that our role in schools and universities is enacting harm on the land, exclusions on learners and teachers, and a disregard for other species to which we have responsibilities, and that we're implicated in this. The ways that this came up in our data can be summarized through the points here, and many of them are very likely familiar to you, and have consequences, material consequences that just go so much deeper than we can kind of summarize with these few words here. But for example, few number of Indigenous scholars who are employed by universities, and the outsized pressure and responsibilities on them is a major challenge. There's barriers to involving Indigenous knowledge holders as co-teachers. That's a really frustrating and confining fact of working within most institutions. One participant we spoke to noted that within history departments specifically, decolonizing theory is often not present, let alone prevalent. There's the problem of token treatment of Indigenous knowledges, or the idea of Indigenous knowledges being static or stuck in the past. And even when institutions do make attempts to work towards decolonizing practices, they often lose their meaning in the ways that they get taken up superficially, or again, in a sort of a static way. So for example, a land acknowledgement script can hold little meaning for participants when they hear it time and time again, if it's not kept alive. So all participants raised issues like this, and spoke about how non-Indigenous teachers or instructors or colleagues also feel a range of uncomfortable emotions when working in relation to Indigenous content. And that range goes from like paralysis and deep fear to outright rejection on the basis of racism or white nationalism. So here's a couple of quotes from our participants. They said, quote, "Here in Canada, we don't like those uncomfortable conversations about how Indigenous people have been subjected to genocide and mistreatment. But the environment has also been subjected to genocide, really. So how do we bring that together?" And secondly, quote, "Thinking more broadly about the need for land literacy and our ability to make meaning and reinterpret what the land is so desperately trying to tell us, I think is greatly impeded by settler colonialism." So by calling this the background, we don't mean to imply that it can be taken for granted. We're calling it that because it's ever present. These issues, though, can also come into the foreground and to intervene in our experience as educators. And so Sarah will give you a sense of what issues arose in the foreground when we spoke to our participants about the barriers to doing climate change education in relation to Indigenous knowledges.
So the overarching barriers that Heather discussed also have implications for teaching social studies and history. And we identified 3 key barriers based on the discussions that we had with scholars. And so the 3 of them are listed here, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of them. So as a result of a lack of Indigenous knowledges within some history departments, scholars noted that teacher candidates often arrive in faculties of education with limited understandings of history. Their views about history are shaped by the narratives they learned or did not learn during their undergrads. Some of the scholars described instances where teacher candidates, even those with a history background, pushed back against their lessons and approaches and claimed that Indigenized histories are not Canadian history. This is just one example of how white nationalism can infiltrate teaching and learning social studies and history. Another significant barrier involves an unwillingness on the part of some teachers and teacher candidates to think creatively and be open to other ways to teach and to approach history. For instance, one scholar noted that it is common for teacher candidates to want to build their content knowledge of history and learn about how to engage their students in analyzing primary sources within the classroom. However, there is very few educators who are interested in land-based learning and ways to bring in other perspectives and experiences of history. There's also a need to move beyond traditional approaches to critical thinking and questioning and towards more transformational experiences by translating theory into action within history education. One scholar in particular observed that, generally speaking, social studies teachers at the elementary level, in their experience, seem to be kind of more open to considering new approaches, whereas in contrast with this, many high school history teachers respond that this just is not what they do when introduced to unfamiliar ways of thinking about and learning about history. The curriculum also creates another barrier to learning in social studies and history at all different levels of education. So although there has been an increase in focus on the histories and present-day legacies of Indian residential schools, these histories often exclude consideration for environmental relationships. So while there are discussions about the removal of Indigenous children from community, culture, and language, there is a lack of focus on how their sense of place was and continues to be disrupted in the process of being displaced from the lands and waters within their communities. The scholars emphasized that the discourse surrounding the need to redress historical and contemporary injustices towards Indigenous people needs to engage how it pertains to the climate crisis and the Anthropocene more generally. So in the process, more can be done to guide students to think about how they are personally implicated in these conversations. Identifying these barriers related to teaching and learning generally, and social studies and history education specifically, is important for understanding the context in which teaching and learning is happening currently, as well as reimagining possibilities for the future. And we now turn to discussing the strengths of social studies and history for responding to climate change and other goals, again, as noted by the scholars that we interviewed. And we have to admit that after a long process of coding and discussing and analyzing and writing up the barriers, we felt very inspired and encouraged reading through these strengths. There's certainly a strong foundation from which we can expand in order to address climate crisis, settler colonialism, and related challenges. So there were 5 overall strengths that we identified, which are listed here. And these are specifically at the intersection with Indigenous knowledges, as the experts we were talking to are not all affiliated with social studies and history teaching. So adequately attending to climate change requires an inherently interdisciplinary approach that addresses multiple contributing factors to the current climate crisis. Social studies already exists in the curriculum as a place that organically brings together history, geography, civics, and politics in ways that can illustrate the complex and intersecting dimensions of climate change. Social studies and history also invites questioning and critical thinking in ways that challenge us to change our thinking. And these shifts in perspective can allow for richer engagement with the topic of climate change and presents opportunities for transformational experiences. Within social studies and history education, many of us recognize the benefit of considering multiple and diverse perspectives when attempting to understand the past. As one scholar we spoke to pointed out, many of us are committed to including Indigenous perspectives and experiences within our approaches to history. Whether in our research or teaching, we often pose questions about whose voices are telling the stories and whose voices are missing. In the context of climate change, centering relationships can serve as a foundation for teaching social studies and history in ways that reflect the importance of land relationships. Indigenous peoples center relationships with other humans, more than humans, and the land, and do so in ways that are in conversation with those who came before and those who will come after. Framing a worldview through relationships with the natural world can inform right relations. This approach serves as a helpful foundation for teaching social studies and history and considering relationships between cultures and communities. And then finally, the fifth strength here, so conversations about climate change benefit from understandings of the past, present, and future, and our place within history. To have a sense of placefulness, we need to understand the histories of the land on which we're situated, so what came before and where we are today. Social studies and history educators with a sense of historical consciousness are often more committed to learning from the past. In the words of one scholar we spoke to, we study the past to reimagine better futures. And so social studies and history, to me, is just such a natural landing place to take up these conversations. And so this idea of reimagining future alternatives brings us nicely into our discussion of suggestions for the future, and I'll turn things back over to Heather for that.
Great, thanks. So what you're about to hear is definitely not the limit of our suggestions for the future. That list is long, but again, we've selected from it for the purposes of the presentation today. And I also want to say they're kind of only just baked in a sense, or perhaps underbaked, because we just completed the pass of the data. And again, it was a bit of an intense piece of work to get ready for today. So we're really still thinking about these implications and look forward to your input. So I've grouped our suggestions for the future into two categories: more familiar, and in the sense of being perhaps sort of resonant with the training and the practices in the field that we're familiar with, and then less familiar from a history and social studies teacher perspective. First, our data suggests that we could be studying histories that show us what happens when humans are disconnected from their ancestral lands. And so, as Sarah sort of introduced in earlier, this example came up in an interview. It was like looking at how Indigenous youth who were apprehended into residential schools or the child welfare system have been prevented from learning the place-based knowledges and languages that would allow them to live off the land if they chose to as an adult. There are many examples of this, unfortunately, across Turtle Island, but also elsewhere in the world. Second, the next suggestion is confronting why relations with the environment is not a priority, in particular, especially settler worldviews. So in other words, how have forces like capitalism shaped the values we hold with respect to the environment and to associated things like employment? So for example, privileging the notion of transferable skills and willingness to be mobile for the sake of employment as really important to human success. How is it that that has so deeply informed the worldview of some humans, but that other humans haven't felt a need for those ideas, or that hasn't been relevant to them? What implications does that have for a willingness to protect the proximate ecological relationships on which we rely? Third, it was emphasized through our interviews that a lot of potential lies in relying on Indigenous knowledges for local environmental content when we're incorporating it into discussions of environmental history or our relationships with what are sometimes called natural resources over time. This is an easy but important way to bring knowledges in that are ecocentric, local, and continuous. Turning to Indigenous knowledges is an easy way to do that, and also may serve to deconstruct our privileging of written accounts over oral or scientific accounts over community knowledges. Fourth, one of the ideas we're most excited about is taking a species-centered approach to curriculum, with an emphasis on Indigenous knowledges throughout that approach, instead of an anthropocentric, event-oriented curriculum. So, of course, to an environmental historian, this is not a novel idea. There's many history books or undergraduate history courses even that center a species and how human relationships with it have changed over time or across space. But we don't see this being brought into K-12 teaching very often, at least not in our context. And we think it would be so successful with youth. The examples that were given to us from our interviews were a unit on salmon, a study of corn, or a tracking of sweetgrass. So I'll move now to the less familiar suggestions, potentially, not sure. So our first is engaging in futures thinking, and I'm really pleased to cite from Kenton Heyer's work on this, and to say that, you know, this has been suggested for history and social studies teachers for a lot of reasons. That we often superficially refer to the future in our classrooms, but that we don't actually invest time in dwelling on or analyzing how the past shapes the present, how what we know now and what we do now will make various future scenarios more likely or less likely, depending on how we interact with the driving forces at play. And so what we're adding to that here is that with Indigenous communities intentionally bringing our attention to walking in the footsteps of our ancestors and privileging, you know, the generations to come in our responsibilities to the earth, that this sort of future thinking can take on those nuances. And therefore inviting students to understand how Indigenous communities that are local to your schools or your universities conceptualize our responsibilities to the past and future can become a call to action. And we need to do that, though, in a way that avoids doom and gloom and also sort of romanticization. So you may have seen that sort of thing coming out of climate fiction or sort of fictional documentaries, futuristic documentaries, and academic publications even. And there's an emotional valence to that, projecting into a future that may bring with it sort of a hesitancy on the part of teachers. As one of our participants explained, quote, arguably to study the past does help us to at least locate ourselves today. But how is it that we can place equal importance on understanding these are the systems we work within and these are the limitations we work within? How then can we be very purposeful with imagining realistic futures? That sounds doom and gloom, but it is. It is that sense of realism and of grounding. I think that would be one of my biggest hesitations. How do we do that in a purposeful way beyond fantasy and romanticization? So it's our contention that by retaining a focus on the fact that there are multiple possible future scenarios and that we can engage and take action to interact with the driving forces that shape those scenarios, we can use that hesitancy and channel it along with the emotions that arise into hopeful action. Dwelling in moments of ecological connection. So if skepticism is arising as you read those words, I invite you to suspend it for a moment and think back on your life to a moment when the earth moved you to feel, or moved you to learn, or moved you to change. Think about that place that you found yourself in, or the being that you found yourself face to face with when you began to have insight that there is a spiritual dimension to the human connection with the more than human, with that there is a metaphysical dimension to that there is an energy that exceeds our language and our rationality and our corporeality, and that interrupts your business as usual. Sarah and Jackson Pind and I have written about moments or places that have given us these kinds of insights and experiences in our own lives, and that we have allowed to interrupt us. And we invite you to think about doing that with your own students, tapping into your own past, your sense of continuity, consciousness, and perspective about where you've come from and what meanings are attached to that. And we think that that should be happening in all classes, all programs, making space for experiences and connections with the environment is no less relevant in a history class than a math class and English class and arts class and environmental studies class. We have to get outside. We have to get in relation to our surroundings and dwell on the insights that come from seeing ourselves as connected to the land. Lastly, very intentionally left to last because we're anticipating that you could be feeling a little destabilized by some of our suggestions. We invite you and recommend that you preserve and nurture sort of your willingness to struggle in this, both individually or independently and together with your peers, your colleagues, your students, and with us. This was so well said by one of our participants with respect to their learning about bringing Indigenous pedagogies into their class. So I'm just going to quote them. In Indigenous education, I'm dealing with the same things as my teacher candidates. Like I'm a few years ahead of them in my journey, but I'm also just alongside them. I'm not an expert. And I think it's unlearning that expertise, like that the teacher is the expert and we can jump in and solve all the problems. That's how I sort of trained as a teacher. You do need to have some expert knowledge, and I do have knowledge, but that everything that is around us is also teaching us. Then what does that mean for me? It's just learning to be alongside has been an important part of my journey, I think, of decolonizing and centering more Indigenous pedagogy. So extending this invitation to the pursuit of learning what it means to teach as environmental devastation comes upon us is about learning to be alongside. It's not in a way that shifts responsibility onto younger generations, but that signals that we are in this together. And our next steps, last slide, and then we're looking forward to your comments and questions. Where we're going from here is continuing to develop findings from the remaining interviews that we didn't share today, to develop a framework for social studies and history education in the Anthropocene. We're working on that now and looking towards a book project, developing teaching resources to be shared on our website, more than what we have already posted there, and extending Sheen's reach within Canada and beyond. So thanks so much. We're really, really grateful for this opportunity to share.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. There's so many things that were of interest. Oh yes, and there's an applause that was on the screen from Allison, one of those reactions at the bottom, and that's I think a good segue into referring to those, because we're going to have I hope some questions and some discussion now with Sarah and Heather. And one way you can do that is by going down to the bottom. There's reactions, and if you look there, you should have a reaction for raise hands, which will immediately have you prominently up in the left-hand corner, I think, of the screen. So it's easy for Sarah and Heather to recognize you. But if you wish, you could also do a chat, post a question in the chat. And for that, Allison is going to be taking a look, and as well as myself. And so, and Allison will feel free to jump in if there's some questions or there's a long lineup going. So for now, I invite questions for Heather or for Sarah, or both together. So please begin. And I see Glenn has got one there to start.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. That was really encouraging. So on the West Coast in BC and in Prince George, in our education faculty, we've just started a research project to try to embed climate change education for teacher candidates. So these are new candidates, and then follow their kind of capacity for teaching about climate in their first year or two of teaching. So I'm just a general question, and anything really, advice for teacher educators who are looking to embed climate education with teacher candidates. You mentioned already some of the reports of reluctance amongst some teachers to take up this work, but I'm just curious if you have further advice.
Wow, that's so exciting. That's awesome. I'm really pleased to hear about it. Yeah, I mean, the thing that I guess comes to mind immediately is attending to the wellness the students who are participating or the teacher candidates who are participating in that work, and inviting them to develop a network of support amongst themselves and strategies, individual strategies that they can use to reflect on and share and process the emotions that might arise for them as they do that work. And by saying emotion, they don't necessarily only mean sadness or anger, but also, excitement and solidarity and triumph, perhaps, or something like that. So just making sure that they are thinking about and attending to their sense of wellness, and tying those wellness practices to connections with the earth, I think would be an amazing invitation. And we know, I just watched a YouTube video last night about Indigenous sort of territory. Oh, I'm missing the word now, but there's increasing numbers of groups of Indigenous youth who are sort of becoming stewards and territorial defenders of the land, and who are being paid to do that work. And the wellness associated with that for them is being documented in research as just really, really high. And so looking at examples like that of organizations that are making a difference and having success, and that these candidates can see themselves as plugging into things that are already going well, as opposed to taking on the burden of doing it all themselves. I think that that sort of disposition might be helpful, but somewhat unrelated to the topic of our presentation, but just in my own teaching, I guess those are the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that as well, and this really addresses one of the major barriers that we talked about with this reluctance to try new things, or to think differently about how about history itself and how we teach history and social studies, is encouraging both yourselves as educators, but also the teachers themselves, just to try new things. And so in my own teaching experience with environmental education, there have been certain activities and things that I've tried to engage teacher candidates in, and it takes a little while, and it takes some reflection, and it takes coming back to these activities and these ways of thinking again and again, and also reminding that we can kind of start off small, and it's not about throwing out the curriculum right away, and kind of slowly incorporating things into your practice, and providing part of what Heather and I and Sheen is trying to do, is to provide examples of what this can look like through some of the resources and things that we've developed. And so providing some examples to teacher candidates can be really a helpful starting point for them.
Thank you very much. Do we have some further questions that people would like to ask? I have a question. I'm quite, there's this discomfort to change is pretty common and pretty understandable. It's for any kind of innovation, whether that's in curriculum content or in some new process, way of doing things. I spent a long time with that, and in terms of cooperative learning, that kind of aspect. So have you looked, what is your implementation? What do you see as an implementation plan? I could see land literacy really interests me, how you would, and getting out there and learning that kind of thing. What you explained this for teacher candidates. How about for in-service teachers, for whom there's often much more limited time for doing repeated examples and coming back to things? What ideas have you got for implementation plans for? It's quite a radical change that you're hoping for, at least.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We did speak to the folks who we interviewed specifically about professional development, and we didn't share a lot of those findings. And in fact, with respect to the Indigenous history theme, like there wasn't a lot shared on that topic that came up in the interviews, but what did come up in interviews with other scholars was often that professional development is just so inadequate. And like in Ontario, for example, it isn't often that teachers get approval for subject-specific professional development. Like, so history-specific professional development doesn't often get it approved as well as, you know, something sort of more cross-curricular, like some topic of the moment that teachers are being asked to do, you know, and address differently. Anyway, so yeah, it is a discouraging situation, or it feels like that right now, about how to kind of reach in-service teachers. But I guess what the approach that Sheen has been taking up until now, and we've only been doing this for, you know, a year and a half or so, we really it's premature to say that we're anywhere near implementation of any big change, but you know, we've just been thinking about trying to support the people who are self-selecting for the work. And so if you're interested, if you're curious, if you're passionate, how do you find a place to hang out and to hang out together and to start to build from there? And that's the approach we're taking. And I am not knocking on the Ministry of Education's door at this point. I don't know that I ever will, to be honest, because I think yeah, I just don't know what will come from that. So we just want to grow a movement from, you know, from the folks who are ready to join us.
Yeah, and we've had folks joining us already. Back in the spring, we had a pre-conference day where that was sort of the beginnings of establishing our network that then kind of turned into the interviews that Heather was talking about. So I think in-service teachers continuing to seek out those opportunities, as Heather said, and hopefully we can continue providing them, whether it be through workshops or the continued lessons that we're hoping to create. Looks like there's a question in the chat here.
Yes, please go ahead.
Do you want to take that one, Sarah? Or?
Could you say a little more on species-centric history teaching? Yeah, so I think Heather can probably talk a little bit more about the specific examples, since she, I think, would remember how they, each of the individual interviewers discussed their ideas. But I think just generally speaking, as Heather did mention before, there are examples out there with reference to undergraduate teaching in history. So the example that comes to mind is the beaver as a species, that kind of centering your curriculum around that, and very much sort of getting students out into the community and learning about the histories of beavers, their interactions with humans, how they have impacted the land, how the people have impacted the species as well. So that's kind of one example that I came across as we started doing our initial literature review. But as Heather mentioned, from some of the curriculum analysis work and that we've done, and some of our knowledge of the curriculum for K-12, that's not really something that's been taken up. And so these examples of corn and salmon and sweetgrass, I think, Heather, if you want to explain a little bit more about those examples.
Sure, yeah. So, you know, taking salmon as an example and developing a whole unit kind of around exploring the various ways that humans have been in relationship to salmon, or that salmon have been in relationship to the waters that they inhabit over time, and allowing that to be sort of the driving force leading into all kinds of other dimensions of history or other content connections that you could explore, and thinking about the economic implications of you know, of salmon harvesting and the changes in the processes of that over time, and the legal frameworks for species management, and the different stakeholders who have different views of that, and the relationship to food and the cultural practices associated with it. And same thing with corn, like the different species of corn, where it's grown, how it's grown in different ways commercially and in indigenous communities, how corn was prepared into different types of products, how, again, the kind of cultural practices around sharing the food, food sovereignty, indigenous knowledges and vocabulary associated with it, and the way that we learn from that being, and the knowledge that it holds, and the way that it can teach us. Yeah.
And do we have another question before we go? Here we have Gary Mills.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for such a fascinating paper. It's made me really think about a number of areas. I was really interested in this idea of land literacy and Tom's question around that. But I just want to shift a little bit of focus onto the point you made about dwellings in moments of ecological connection. And I just wonder whether we've got into ways of working with young people where we're presenting issues around the environment, ecological matters, climate change as kind of complete disasters in a way that, sort of, that we've got to fix this and we've got to fix it in a hurry. Now, obviously, there's a lot in that and a lot of truth in that. But I just wonder about this sense of wonder with the natural world and the ecology that's around them. But my question relates to, how do we build that into a kind of curriculum that's really overcrowded already? How do we begin to do that? And I wonder whether we need to think beyond the curriculum, the formal curriculum, and almost try and find ways to do this outside of that formality and build it in. I just wonder whether you've got any comments around that kind of that view.
Yes, we should do it in all the ways that we can, including subverting the curriculum if necessary, or stretching the curriculum and leaving some things out. I don't know that, I mean, not everybody feels they have the agency to do that, I guess, or the job security to do that. But I do think it's important that we start taking this emergency seriously and leaving some stuff on the cutting room floor and coming back to what's important right now. But I also agree and would love to see sort of extracurricular or additional opportunities for youth to engage with the environment, to build relationships with the environment. Not everyone has good access to those opportunities. They cost money, they take time. You have to have somebody encouraging you to attend or supporting you to be there, which not every young person has an adult in their life who can kind of facilitate that. And so, yeah, I definitely agree that everything that we can do is going to contribute something important. And there's a lot more flexibility in those extra outside of the curriculum experiences, going on journeys, going on expeditions, even very local ones, can be really transformative. And I've seen that in other research that I've done. So I very much support that, but it does take funding. It does take a lot of resources to create those extra opportunities and to ensure that there aren't barriers to accessing them.
Thank you. Can I just mention one follow-up point to that? There's just that idea of sort of squeezing things, well, not squeezing things in, but developing things outside of that formal curriculum, if I can put it like that. And that's a colleague here has worked on a project called Young People's Geography, and this is around young people literally on their way walking to school and really spotting things from the natural world, things from the physical world that strike them. And I just think it's such a great way of like starting and ending days with young people. And it's got a large focus on primary school or elementary education, but I know some schools have been trying to work around that with year 7 pupils, so like 11, 12-year-olds here as well. So just a brief comment.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for that suggestion. And like that happened with my teacher candidates yesterday in class, just by accident. And we ended up having a really long conversation about what we could learn from squirrels. And it was just really awesome and beautiful. And I'm sure that many people in that class are paying more attention to squirrels today as a result of that conversation. So yeah, I love that.
Gary, if you could put that reference and anything, and any, if there's a web link or something like that in the chat, that so others could follow that up, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll try and find it and put it up.
Okay, very good. So that's our time, and so I would thank you very much to you, Sarah Karn and Heather McGregor, for a very stimulating presentation. There's lots of things that you've covered, and a great deal of things that you've covered. And I hope that it's been useful for all of you, especially I think of some of you that are in the United Kingdom. I hope some of these ideas out of Canada will be helpful to you. We're going to break into some small groups where you can carry on this discussion further.